The Learning Systems Institute presents the FSU Distinguished Scholar Video Series in Instructional Systems. This series is dedicated to Dr. Robert M. Gagne, Professor Emeritus, the Florida State University.
Hello, I'm Bob Morgan, Director Emeritus of the Learning Systems Institute, which is the organization which has sponsored the production and development of the series of tapes, of which you now have one. This group of 56 tapes was developed in order to capture some of the history and to look at some of the future of instructional development in this country. I hope you enjoy these tapes and find them useful.
This program is the first in a series of 2 tapes discussing advice to grad students. This topic is discussed by these leading instructional systems faculty: Dr. Robert Branson, Dr. Walter Dick, Dr. Marcy Driscoll, Dr. Don Ely, Dr. Roger Kaufman, Dr. John Keller, Dr. Robert Morgan, Dr. Robert Reeser, Dr. Jim Russell, Dr. Walt Wager.
I think in terms of graduate students, probably one of the best things graduate students can do is to try to get teaching experience, assuming they're going into teaching, while they're in graduate school. At Purdue, we work very hard to involve our students in teaching. I realize that a lot of places don't do that, and so even if your department doesn't have money for an assistantship or such, even if you have to volunteer to work with a faculty member whom you respect. And I know some students, even at Purdue, we only have so many assistantships. Everybody can't always teach, but I've had students that have volunteered to work with me or another faculty member. Or it's possible sometimes to pay them in course credit. They'll do it as a practicum or an internship. So I think as a graduate student, get the kind of experience that you want to have and do for the rest of your life. If it is doing research and whatever, then get experience doing that. My own experiences and the experience of many of my graduate students are that in graduate school, you don't know what you're going to be doing. So that's why I would recommend get experience teaching, get some experience doing research, and get some experience doing writing as a co-author with a faculty member. A lot of advantage to that. Mainly the faculty member can provide guidance and direction, hopefully if you pick the right person. Also, co-authored with somebody that's known in the field, it's more likely to be published. Unfortunately, it may be the same quality as if Jane Smith, as a graduate student, authored herself and Jane Smith and Dr. Jones, but Dr. Jones's name on there, unfortunately or fortunately maybe, will help to get it published. So do get the kind of experiences that you want. Something I guess that I have done that's worked for me is follow your instincts. I think, again, you look at the local environment, very similar to graduate students deciding, do I go into academia or business and industry? You have to decide for yourself, and so I think as academic programs, we need to do the same thing. Where can we be most successful? Where can we make the most impact? And so I would have no objections being in the School of Business or School of Technology. So again, I don't think it's where you are, but what you're able to do. It's like a rose is a rose is a rose. And so I realize it's an important question, but not one that I feel I could say in every case we should do it this way. One other thing comes to mind, particularly as you're designing instruction or as you're teaching, and this is something that I learned from Sam Postlewaite when I went to work for him back in 1970, and I keep it in mind as I'm designing materials today or as I'm teaching a class, and that is, don't give the students answers for which they have no questions. Think about that a little bit. Like a lot of professors, and we've all been in classes with these professors that do just that. They give you answers and you don't even know what the question is. And so I think one of the things we're seeing in student-centered learning, in collaborative learning, cooperative learning, and all those kind of things is to develop the right questions and then the student will find the answers. In most cases, the professor doesn't have to give the answers. An example of that is working with graduate students deciding on a career. I don't look at a graduate student and say, Dan, you ought to go to business and industry. In fact, you ought to go to work for Motorola. No, that's not my role as a professor. My role is to get you to ask the right questions, collect the data, and come up with your own answer. And I think that applies whether you're in kindergarten or whether you're just finishing your doctoral program.
I think this is the advice I would give to graduate students and people entering the field. First of all, never look at the same piece of paper twice. Deal with what's in front of you, do something about it, and then leave it. Transfer it to somebody else, take action, or throw it in the wastebasket. A second piece of advice is when doing instructional design and development, be a surrogate learner. When you work with a subject matter specialist, ask, what would I think of this as a student? How would I use this information? What's missing? If you can assume the role of a learner, it's likely that the kind of development you do with your subject matter specialist will be much more useful and relevant. A third piece of advice would be try to make everything you do serve at least two purposes. If you're giving a presentation, try to publish it. If you write an article and it's published, use it as a presentation. If you create justification for a budget, try to use it in more than one place. Try to make everything you do serve more than one purpose. Practice what you teach. So many times we talk a good game, but we don't show in our own practice the design principles that we advocate or that we think others should follow. So practice what you teach. I guess these would be some of the distilled pieces of advice that I'd like to pass along to graduate students.
Well, first of all, don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how we learn. That's the concept of continuous improvement, is that you learn from the mistakes and revise as required. Somebody coming into the program or coming into the field, or both. Beware of the conventional wisdom. Get out of your comfort zones. Tomorrow is not a linear projection of yesterday and today. It goes in step functions. Things are dramatically different now than they were 5 years ago. Realize that the same paradigms and tools that got them to be successful and others successful will get them into trouble in the future. For instance, we used to think that it's really important to do systems analysis as the first thing, or front-end analysis at the front end. And then if you do that, you're just perpetuating the status quo. Because analysis is what? Breaking things down into their individual component parts and finding out how they work independently and together. But it doesn't answer the question of what should you analyze. That's the assessment question. So don't start with analysis, start with assessment. Look at the future. As Peter Drucker says, if you can't predict the future, create it. Don't be afraid to deviate from the conventional wisdom of the day. Build a new reality, not just try to polish up the old one. Again, a trite Druckerism is we're getting better and better at doing that which should not be done at all. So that's why I would encourage them to look at boundaries beyond individual human performance improvement, to look at organizational improvement and societal improvement. Don't be afraid of topics outside of our field. There's a tendency for people to only want to take the courses in our program or department. There's brilliant people all over this university and other university. Go and learn what their take is on life. Learn how economists think and how sociologists think and how engineers think. And then integrate, pick from those skills and tools and concepts and ideas that we can use to build together a better tomorrow. So people get their conflict over means and not ends. And if you move the ends up and get them to consider mega-level societal benefits, then people agree on a lot. Now what they disagree on is the favored ways to get there. And this is how we can design performance systems on the basis of what people bring to the situation and what their predilections are, their preferences are. I'd probably read the newest version of the ISPI, Performance System Handbook, that Stolovich and Keeps are now revising. The first one is out, the new one will be out soon. That gives a lot of thinking of a lot of people. Either that or my recent co-edited guidebook for human and organizational improvement. Not because it's good, because it has a lot of the pieces that people have to consider. I wouldn't want them to read Megger's six-pack, and simply because it is so clear and it is so concise. If they're not going to do that, I would want them to read Walt Dick's book. But then I wouldn't want them to miss Keller's ABCD model. And again, I'm sorry he hasn't written a book with this in it. Of my stuff, I think probably the best is the revised strategic thinking book. That's an interesting question. Can I ponder that for another 10 years and come back and tell you? There's some wonderful stuff. There's also some garbage out there. There's some really handy-dandy how-to-do-it incomplete guidebooks that makes everybody warm and comfortable. And it reminds me of, I think it was Mencken who said, for every one problem, there is one solution.
I really think that two ends of the continuum. One, you have to decide what you stand for, what you put, where you'll put your feet in the ground and say, this is what I believe in, this is where I stand morally and ethically. And then you say, on the other hand, I have to be flexible, because we're in a profession that responds to a world that's changing very rapidly, and I cannot be dogmatic. I have to use my knowledge and experience and apply it in an ever-changing environment. And so it's a mix of those two, the flexibility but knowing the things you're not going to be flexible on. But the other kinds of advice of like work hard. There's somebody else sitting over here, you say, hey, you better relax a little bit and make sure you get to know people. Well, on the other hand, somebody else, stop interacting with people and sit down and think for a while. So, it depends on where you are in your career, what your career goals are. Advice is going to differ. Some who know our field see us as relatively rigid and inflexible kinds of people who kind of know-it-alls. Here's the way you do it. And I think that we have to work hard to not be that way, that we do have to be flexible with our use of knowledge and open to looking at other ways of doing things. I think that's what's always interesting when you go into a new organization, is to see how they do things. And every once in a while you say, boy, is that a good idea? And then other times you say, that is the stupidest way I've ever, how can they do that? Advice that my friend Duncan gave me many, many years ago was, Walter, and this is when I'm tearing my hair out over some stupid, thing that Florida State was doing. He said, every institution has its craziness. Just learn what it is and learn to deal with it. Don't try to change it. And so I've always thought about that whenever, particularly you go into a new organization and you see some of the, really absurd things they do, at least from your point of view, that have probably been procedures and methodologies that have grown up over years, and it just kind of got to be that way, and that's the way we do it. And you just say, well, that's part of their craziness. Let it be. Let's get on with something where you can be productive.
Some people are more suited to design. I said there are high-level people and detail people. I'd probably overgeneralize. I mean, there are people who do both. Some people like the routine of, say, task analysis and those kinds of things, job task analysis, and some people that just won't fit for. So I think you need to work. Well, another advice for graduate students would be to take as many different professors as you can. Don't take the same professor over and over and over, because after the first class you pretty much know what that person's got to say, and different professors have different things to say. So I think I would, expose myself broadly to a lot of different viewpoints and a lot of different ideas from different professors. And then once you decide what it is you want to do, take the personal interest in that to become the expert in it, for yourself. Because by the time you get out of here, in any particular thing, you'll know more about it than any of the professors in the program. They take a personal interest in some aspect of instructional design or instructional technology and start to become expert at that. They start to dig into that, read the literature, read everything they could know about it, discuss it, work that into their papers, into their ideas, helping and becoming a part of collegial, becoming part of the profession that you want to become a part of early in the graduate experience. So helping out with classes, either formally, as supervised teaching or as informally as just volunteers, I think would be very beneficial. Getting involved in some collaborative writing projects. That's where I think it's as much for the professor as it is for the student. It gets you out of the box and helps you bring somebody else along and helps them come along too.
In our field, I think that the more you can learn, the better, and the more open-minded you are toward learning as much as you can, experiencing as much as you can while you're in the program, the better. Because in our field, we have a body of knowledge, of theory, of principles, of procedures, of technologies that we use, but those things are not ends in themselves. In other words, we're not pursuing psychology as a quest just to learn more about people, or biology to learn more about people from a different perspective. Our concern is with changing behavior. And to change behavior, you have to know an awful lot about the context, the people, the environment in which those people exist to help change their behavior, through instruction and through the other elements of their environment that might affect their behavior. And you have to be able to communicate with those people, talk to them in terms that they understand. So the more you can learn and the more you have an attitude toward learning, open-mindedness toward learning, the more you can, I think, help bridge and understand another person's perspective. I remember actually a psychology professor once, when I was an undergraduate, asking us if we could think of anything we might learn that wouldn't potentially be useful. And so he phrased the question something like that. So some of the students in the class, tried to come up with these really strange and bizarre, areas of information to see if they could put him to the test. But everything he would bring up, then he would create some hypothetical situation in which that might be useful knowledge. And so I don't know, that was another thing, that one of those little isolated events that impressed me, because I think it's more of an attitude than it is the actual knowledge itself. Being an attitude of wanting to be receptive to what another person is really saying, rather than feeling like somehow you've got to keep pushing your perspective and what you're saying onto them. So my number one piece of advice to students before they get here and while they're here is a very open attitude toward learning, and an open-minded attitude toward other people, and trying to develop as much of an empathetic perspective as they can. And by empathetic, I mean being able to understand another person's perspective, not just intellectually, but also from the feelings perspective and influences on their life, from a more holistic perspective than just do you know what a behavioral objective is, or these are not behavioral objectives, etc. Read, you just have to read and read and read and take notes, and just an enormous amount of reading. And of course that was one of the big benefits of being in graduate school. It's just, the courses to me were just a stimulus that required, I learned things, quote, from the courses, but most of what I learned was just from the discipline of having to read and read and write papers and think about it. So It's the reading, it's the reflecting on what you've read, having to write a paper, you know, having a goal. I don't think you can just read. You also have to write. I mean, you have to speak, write. You have to be actively working with the material. And then, I mean, it's so hard to get across to people the idea sometimes that you really have to dissect an article to thoroughly understand it. So many people feel, you know, students I'm thinking of, that if they read an article once or twice, that's it. You know, they've got it. But I found in reading research reports and trying to thoroughly understand what a person did, what they didn't do, what could have been done instead, you know, what have they really contributed, I would have to read it 3 or 4 times and then go back and reread parts of it still again. And then the thing suddenly starts to deconstruct, you know, and you can begin to see the assumptions that the person was making and limitations that they never tell you, but are just kind of, they're kind of there by inference, but the inferences are not immediately apparent. You know, they only come out through these multiple readings. And then you begin to see in the literature lines of development. You know, I mean, you know, the work of McClellan built on the work of Murray. I mean, Maslow, which built on the work of Murray, you know, which built on other people. So it's reading from a historical perspective as well as picking up on different lines of research and beginning to say, well, you know, these people over here, they're using different metaphors, they're using different tradition of concepts and theories, but what they're talking about seems, in some respects, very similar to what these people over here are talking about. You know, and you're the one that it's you that has to read in both of those areas and start building the bridges. And then, not only being a student, you know, of your area of interest, and I don't just mean a student in a formal classroom, I mean a student in terms of being in a learning receptive mode, but also having opportunities to teach and work with other people helps you gain insights. I mean, the technique I use for audience analysis, using the old traditional inverted U curve to plot out where people are on the different dimensions of motivation, that actually formalized itself in the classroom one day. When I was presenting and I was talking about the Yerkes-Dodson law and the inverted U curve and how motivation is, you know, it can be too low or too high, excessive stress versus boredom. And then it just suddenly occurred to me, and I just started talking about being able to map these different dimensions on there, and so forth. Anyway, that just occurred. I don't know if that would have occurred to me if I was just sitting at home at my desk. So I think it's that kind of absorption from both the student perspective and also communication with other people about what you're doing, which teaching can offer you the opportunity to do. I would tell them to try to be enthusiastic, to try to enjoy being a student of their own game as much as they possibly can, to learn how to enjoy working with graduate students, to act confident whether they feel confident or not, to not feel threatened. You know, they're going to have graduate students that are brilliant, you know, 3 times beyond what they are. Don't worry about it. You know, you have something to contribute. Focus on that. Try to enjoy the moments of your work. You know, try to avoid letting yourself be dragged down by excessive stress. Try to keep a focus on what the essentials are for this line of work, which are certainly to publish, to be professionally active, to be responsible to your students through your teaching, through taking it seriously, through doing your very best, through being available to them, and to you know, make some contribution to the organization that you're part of, both the one that's paying your salary, you know, that you're working for, and your professional organizations.
This program is the first in a series of 2 tapes discussing advice to grad students.